Hi everyone, and welcome to Getting Started with Oral Histories, hosted by the LIR Committee. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. Audience cameras are off and mics are muted, but we encourage participation using the webinar's interactive features. During the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do so, just type your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of the control panel. The speakers will address as many questions as they can during the Q&A session, which will come at the end of the presentations. You'll see the chat box is also enabled, and you're very welcome to submit comments or feedback on the webinar through the chat, or even just say hello and tell us where you're joining from. However, please use the Q&A for questions, as we won't be monitoring the chat for questions. We are recording this webinar and we'll share the link after the event. If you'd like to tweet about the event hashtag is #LIR Oral Histories. So without further ado, I'll now introduce the chair of today's event, David Kane, who is the Systems Librarian at the Waterford Institute of Technology and a member of the LIR Committee. So David has a background in IT and is an advocate of open source and open access in academia. And David has also been instrumental in fostering an Irish library carpentry community as a way of keeping academic librarianship relevant to the evolving needs of the research community. So over to you now, David.
Thanks, Anya, and also thanks, Stephanie. Anya is the Operations and Communications Manager in DRI, and Stephanie, with me here, is Digital Learning Specialist in UCC Library. And we're part of the LIR Committee, which is a broad committee from across all of the academic libraries in Ireland. Just a note about LIR. LIR stands for Library Information Resources. It was founded over 25 years ago, and its mission is really to keep librarians and academic librarians in particular engaged and informed about new technologies that affect their practice. We believe that the transcription and coding of oral histories are increasingly relevant topics so we've designed this plenary to equip academic librarians and a broader range indeed of digital archivists, data stewards, researchers and historians with the knowledge and information necessary to plan an oral history project. And when we were discussing this, we kind of saw that there were a few areas really, policy, regulatory frameworks, technique, protocols, and indeed technology affecting the whole technology, which really is kind of driving this. Our speakers today are going to touch on all of those areas. First up, we have Dr. Aileen O'Carroll from the DRI, Liz Kylie from the School of Applied Social Studies in UCC, and Doug Boyd, the director of the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries. So each of our speakers will talk for approximately 20 minutes. And firstly, we have Dr. Aileen O'Carroll, who is the policy manager at the Digital Repository of Ireland and manager at the Irish Qualitative Data Archive. And her work in the field of digital data is concerned with research methods, ethics, privacy, and research data management. She advises researchers on the best practice in managing and archiving research projects, both to ensure that the ethical commitments are met and that the data gathered is of the highest standard to facilitate optimal reuse by a variety of audiences. And as a sociologist, she has used qualitative research in her books Working Time Knowledge Work and Post-Industrial Society and the Dublin Docker. She has published 2 research collections on the Digital Repository of Ireland, that's the DRI, the Life History and Social Change collection, and the Repeal the Eighth and Reproductive Rights collection. She advised the Growing Up in Ireland team on the protocols used to publish their qualitative data set. And Aileen will be speaking to us today about policy and consent forms for collecting and preserving oral histories. Thank you, Aileen.
Thank you to everybody. I was once told by a psychologist that I have very poor autobiographical memory. So I think it's funny that now I spend so much time collecting stories from other people's memories and of their lives. I finished my PhD in sociology, I think in 2002, poor autobiographical memory, I'm not exactly sure. And one of the few memories I have of that research process is sitting in my supervisor's office, discussing the interviews I was about to start recording, and my supervisor saying, I suppose you should have a consent form. And he sent me a blank statement that I should adjust. And this is the consent form that he sent me. This letter confirms that the bearer is carrying out research under my direction. It explains how we treat information you provide and commits us to respecting confidentiality. In order to facilitate accuracy in social science research, it is vitally important that the researcher have access to informed and authoritative sources. The recording of interviews with such informants helps to ensure accuracy in the research process. At the same time, researchers are under an obligation to protect and trust the trust which sources place in them. In view of the above, the interviewer agrees to abide by all interviews. The interviewee may at any time opt for on the record. Such remarks will be available without attribution. In any report placed in this research, including a report to the sponsor or the funder, quota remarks will be attributed in a manner that preserves the anonymity of the interviewee. No material gathered in off-the-record interview will be attributed to the interviewee in quotation or otherwise without the interviewee's written consent. And all individual interview material, tapes, transcripts, and notes remain within the research team and cannot be seen by the funding organisation. And then finally, a list of interviewees will be attached to the final report submitted to the funding organisation. Any interviewee may request that their name can be omitted from the list. And we're happy to discuss any changes, and it's signed by the researcher and the research supervisor. So when I found this consent form, the first thing I noticed is that it wasn't actually a consent form, but a confidentiality statement. And it wasn't signed by the interviewee, but it was signed by me and my supervisor. Part of this is due to difference in the way social scientists, I was trained sociologists, and oral historians are trained. Traditionally, the sociologist's default is to anonymize data for ethical reasons, while traditionally oral historians do not. The Oral History Association's principles and practice notes, because of the importance of context and identity in shaping the content of an oral history narrative. It is the practice in oral history on what are known as rights agreements or release forms. The latter is also known as deeds of gift or copyright assignments. And they're documents that allow archival repositories to make the recordings and transcripts available to the public for research. In the past, those agreements have asked for a transfer of copyright from the interviewee to the interviewer. Now it's more common practice to ask for a Creative Commons license to be put on the document. Sociologists, in contrast, and you can see in this declaration, rarely have asked about copyright. However, over time, the historical differences between the two disciplines have lessened. Times have changed in other ways. This is how I saved my research on when I was conducting it initially, and so have consent forms. So I'm going to share you now the current advice that I give to researchers when they ask me about consent forms. And the first thing is that it's not just a consent form that people are writing, it's an information sheet and a consent form. A good information sheet will be written in plain language. And yes, my consent form, my confidentiality agreement from 2002 was generally written in plain language. It will outline the purpose of research, what is involved in participation, possibly what methodology will be used, whether it's a one-term meet, a longer term, will you meet 2-3 times, whether there's some collaborative involvement. It'll outline what the mechanism of withdrawal, how can an interviewee leave an interview if they no longer want to take part in it. What are the benefits to the individual in taking part in the interview, and are there any risks attached to that? There will often be a statement about confidentiality and anonymity. There will be some statements saying how the data will be used. There'll be something that talks about data management, storage and retention, where the data will be kept and for how long will it be archived. So if you look at my early statement, yes, there was a statement on confidentiality was assumed. There was no question asked of it. There was something saying how it might be used. It said there would be a final report and it would be used by the research team, but that was clearly insufficient because it's also going to be used possibly in publications, in presentations, in journal articles. There was nothing else covered in that old confidentiality agreement. So the consent form, which is usually a separate page, should include, I advise, as an explicit question asking people that whether they're willing to participate, a question that will outline that they can understand that they can withdraw from the interview at any time without giving any excuse or explanation. It'll have some question on anonymity and a question of archiving. Ideally, you should also have, if you're going to archive, and in this talk, because I'm an archivist, I'm going to assume that you're not just collecting interviews yourself, that you are interested in archiving them. You should have a separate consent to about asking, are people willing to have the data archiving, information of where the data should be archived, in what form it will be archived, will it be anonymized, will it not, will it be audio, will it be just transcripts, and who will be able to access it. None of this was done way back when I was doing my PhD research. So when I was burying this paper and looking at these consent forms and the advice we now give, just this story from my childhood, the porridge pot, came to my mind as a metaphor that perhaps captures how researchers might feel. I love porridge. Porridge is a good thing, but maybe there's too much of it at the moment. Maybe there's too much confusion about consent forms. And what I would hope in the rest of this part of the talk is to try and unpick what's happening to consent forms and where the changes have happened over time. Now, researchers need to be aware of both the ethical and the legal aspects which cover the creation and the reuse of research data. So we have an ethical commitment, and we also have a commitment under Gdpr legislation. The consent form, the confidential statement that I used way back when, that was really focusing on and drawing on researcher ethics. So researcher ethics traditionally focus on types of harm that might come to participants who are taking part in research projects. And sadly, it's usually informed by bad examples, by unethical cases of research that's happened in the past. So when you're looking at your research ethically, you're asking yourself these questions. Is there harm, potential harm to the interviewee? So you're thinking about harm, perhaps in things of embarrassment, more serious personal disclosure or disclosure about legal activity that affects the interviewee. In Ireland, we really have to consider the threat to the interviewee of a defamation court case if they say something that's potentially defamatory or perceived to be defamatory. In the literature, more recently, there's also consideration of third-party mentions. That's harm to others. If your interviewee says something that might cause embarrassment to another person or disclose the illegal activity of another person. So I'm going to draw on three different examples to show how these questions, ethical questions of harm, have been dealt with in different research projects. So the first one is a project that I undertook myself. We did interviews with participants in the repeal referendum, people who were actively organizing for a yes vote. We had an ethical commitment to protect these participants from harm. and we had to do an ethical approval process in which we thought in advance about what those harms might be. And one obvious harm is that at the time, for most of the interviews lives, abortion was illegal, and they're actively campaigning for abortion services. So it's quite likely that many of them would have broken the law by providing women with abortion pills or information. So we had to consider about potential for harm if they disclose this and how we would react to that. One thing that we didn't anticipate but came up in the course in the interviews, that many of the interviewees had worried about their future employment prospects if they were identified as being pro-choice, particularly those people who worked in the voluntary or community sector, which has very high church involvement, or in any of the medical spheres. So our solution to those fears was to offer anonymity. We archive those interviews without their audio, only with transcripts. It is possible to archive audio, but it's very time consuming. Retracting segments is more doable than actually anonymizing. But you have to remember that if you remove audio, you reduce the quality of your data. As Australian poet and writer David Foster said, a living voice is a landscape of which the transcript in print is the merest map. Similarly, Bradley and Puri argue that sarcasm, irony, laughter, and silence all provide meaning and all need to be heard. The voice conveys historical meaning through tone, emphasis, and accent. Background noise conveys place, and the audio quality conveys the recording space. And that's definitely true in our interviews. The interviews where you only have the transcripts are much easier for somebody else to misinterpret than the interviews where you have the audio, particularly if somebody is being self-deprecating or making a joke. So this is an example of, as Shopes argue, ethical decisions are judgment calls, which are not fixed, but they're rather shifting social constructs arising in relation to the particular historical circumstances, in this case, doing research about abortion in Ireland, within which oral history is being practiced. So a second example of harm, and I'm sure many of you know about this example, is the Boston College oral history interviews. Here you had 3 researchers who conducted 85 interviews with 40 interviewees between 2001 and 2006. The interviews were archived in Boston College and used as source material for a book. There were interviews with people who had been involved in the conflict in Northern Ireland on both sides of the conflict. They were collected for the public good, but in archiving them, harm came to the archive, to the interviewers, to interviewees and the researchers. The tapes of the interviews with the former participants were seized after a lengthy court battle. Researchers and archivists received death threats. People have been arrested based on the material in the tapes. So here's a clear example where the oral history and the archiving of the history caused harm, and offering anonymity here wasn't a solution. And if you are, in your consent form, offering anonymity, you need to be aware of the limits to that within Irish law. There is no researcher privilege within Ireland. So, for example, in my university, we are required to include a statement on our consent forms that outline that the right to confidentiality is important, but it's not absolute. And in some circumstances, confidential research data might be overridden by the courts. That means in some circumstances, you've promised confidentiality, but the right of the courts to request that will trump that promise. In the case of my university, that clause has been inserted following an example of research where some people were doing research for their PhD, and they were interviewing activists who were involved in the Shell to Sea campaign. A number of the researchers ended up getting arrested. Their recording device ended up in the front of the police van, continued to record. When they listened to it afterwards, they heard that the Garda who arrested them had been making threats to rape them. They made this public. There was obviously a huge issue. There was a police investigation, and the police wanted to hear the transcripts, listen to the transcripts. But the first part of the transcripts were interviews with people where they had offered confidentiality. So it's an example of how sometimes you have to understand that you're not going to be able to offer complete confidentiality. Finally, you can often, from the sociologist perspective, people, and the default definitely was when I was doing my research, was to offer anonymity. But there is also a harm caused by erasure. And I'm highlighting here another research project that we have in DRI, which is an oral history project, which interviewed people who had been incarcerated in Magdalene institutions. So here the reason for conducting the research and for participating in the research was to give voice to a harm that had been done in the past. It's a process of giving voice to the voiceless. So in this respect, it would not be suitable to offer anonymity to protect from harm. So if we look from the perspective of research ethics, we can see some of the aspects of the information sheet questions that I outlined are concerned with this question of protecting interviews from harm. That's where you ask them what's involved in the participation, what will the nature of the participation be, outlining that people can withdraw and they're completely free to withdraw, outlining the benefits and the risk, and then offering confidentiality. Those statements are all aimed at ensuring that there is informed consent, no deception, protecting from harm. I'm going to come back to this consent in a little bit. Before I do, I want to move on to the next major influence on consent forms, which is my favorite, GDPR. Personal data is the new oil of the internet and the new currency of the digital world, said the European Consumer Commissioner in 2001. In 2010, personal data belonging to millions of Facebook users was collected without their consent by the British consulting firm Cambridge Analytica, predominantly to be used in political advertising. It was collected by a data scientist who was involved in a company called Global Science Research. The app was going to build up questions of psychological processes on users, and it was used to provide assistance to the 2016 presidential campaign of Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. So when we think of GDPR, often the focus of much discussion, particularly in the media, is on business. It's on internet, social media, Facebook, Twitter. In fact, in Ireland, the first data breach fine we had was of Twitter, who were fined 450k for not notifying the data commissioner within the required 72 hours of a data breach that was caused by a bug on Android devices. However, just to get rid of the Trump thing, the origins of GDPR also have an ethical background. The origins of it come back to the experience of those living in Germany, both before and after the war, where the government collected private data and used that data to harm individuals. So when the Nazis came to power in the 1930s, they collected data related to religion and medical conditions, and that highly personal data was then processed in computers and fed into the Nazis' killing machine. So there is an ethical aspect to GDPR. I'm going to quote the the EU Data Protection Supervisor, who said, in the EU, human dignity is recognized as an absolute fundamental right. In this notion of dignity, privacy, or the right to a private life, to be autonomous, the control of information about yourself, to be let alone, plays a pivotal role. Privacy is not only an individual right, but it's a social value. The right to privacy or private life is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the European Convention of Human Rights and the European Charter of Human Rights. So how does GDPR approach ethics differently from the research ethics I've been talking about differently earlier? So this is a picture of me. Research ethics use the language of a participant or interviewee or informant. GDPR uses the language of data subject. Research ethic applies to all research. GDPR only applies to living people who are identifiable. Research ethics are contextual, they're fluid, they're informed by your own ethical positions and the ethical positions of the research associations that you're a member of your universities and your research context. In contrast, GDPR is codified into an EU agreement and a national law, the Data Protection Act 2018. When I say codified, it's not as clear-cut as we might want, and there's a lot of issues that will ultimately be settled in the courts, how they be interpreted. The primary aim of research ethics government is the protection of participants from harm, whereas the primary aim of data protection law is intended to provide a balancing act between the rights of data subjects and the free flow of information to promote economic and social development. So if you conduct unethical research, you will hopefully go to research hell and lose the respect of your peers. If you break GDPR, you can be fined millions and millions of pounds. How does GDPR get reflected in the information sheet? Well, as I said earlier, informed consent is a shared ethical and data protection concern, even if they're coming at it from different directions. So questions of purpose of the research, how data will be used, will the data be archived, they're also GDPR questions. But some of the questions that are newer to that information sheets are more directly coming from GDPR. That's questions like who has access to the data, data management, storage, how long the data will be kept for, where it will be kept. So there's two ethical considerations in oral history, and Mary Larson has categorized this into two main categories. Firstly, legislated, what can one do? And secondly, voluntary, what will you do? Legislated is enforced by GDPR, voluntary is enforced by our own ethical positions and the ethical review boards that we have to meet. So an alternative title for this talk would have been A Tale of Two Consents. On one hand, you've got research consent that draws from research ethics, do no harm. On the other hand, you've got legal consent, which draws from GDPR, EU privacy law, and human rights law. In research ethics, you almost always, but not exclusively, require consent to gather data. In contrast, GDPR outlines 6 lawful reasons for processing data. Consent is one, but there are 5 other reasons you could use and still legally gather data. So privacy and human rights are enshrined in GDPR, but privacy isn't an absolute right. This is a picture of the Stasi Archive. So, as many of you know, the Stasi was a network of civilian informers that were used to spy on their fellow citizens in Germany. In 1995, when the wall fell down, the people Stasi agents working in the archive began shredding all the documents that they had collected on their population. In 1995, the archive began this incredible project of reassembling the documents that had been shredded. There were nearly 16,000 bags of shredded material, and estimated 33 million pages. So this is all highly personal data. In the Stasi archive at the moment, you can receive your file from the archive because it's your information, and you can get the name of Stasi and the names of the people who informed on you and their employer and the collaborators are not redacted. However, the names of other people who suffered rights violations are withheld by default. Consent is one of the main reasons for getting permission to process data. And if you have consent as a reason for processing data, then you have the right to remove consent, which means the data can be removed. This doesn't happen in the Stasi archive. If I was an informer or a collaborator and I request the archive to remove my data because I'm embarrassed, I don't want people knowing that I was ratting them out, the Stasi archive under GDPR would not remove that data. So there is within GDPR a balancing of rights to the individual with the rights of the public good and society in general. I'm talking about this because the UK British Library and the Oral History Society both recommend collecting data. The GDPR uses the language of processing data. I'm going to just use it, doing interviews, using a public or historical research category rather than consent. So in Ireland, those reasons are outlined in Section 42 of the Data Protection Act. That says you can collect data if you're for archiving purposes in the public interest, for scientific or historical research purposes, or statistical purposes. And if you do that, you also have to carry out some particular safeguards. If you decide that you're going to archive in the public interest or collect data in the public interest, you need to be able to show that you're doing it for the public good and not purely for the personal or corporate interest or private gain. And you have to be able to reconcile the requirements of research, whether it's historical or for evidence, with the rights and freedoms of the data subject. You also have to safeguard your data, and those safeguards are outlined in Section 38 of the Data Protection Act 2018. So the UK British Library and the Oral History Society argue that you shouldn't use consent as a ground for doing interviews, because if consent is a requirement and somebody withdraws consent under GDPR, you would automatically have to remove their data. However, the question of data withdrawal is both a data protection issue and an ethical issue. So you need to ask yourself, do you have an ethical responsibility to withdraw data when requested? And if you do, you make sure that when you put that in your consent form, your information form, that you make it reasonable and limit it in a way that it can be implemented. What I mean is, if you say, you can withdraw your data at any time, and you've then written a book and you've produced quotes from it, if somebody withdraws that data, that book will have to be pulped. So usually what we advise people to do is say, you may withdraw from the project at any time up to the point of publication. So that example I'm outlining is to show that the legal basis for processing can be different from your ethical commitments, but you have to justify why you're doing one thing or another. So to finish, I just want to leave you with these thoughts. Each data set is different. So the decisions you make in terms of the consent form and information sheet will be different. It's up to you to be mindful, to be thoughtful, to consider carefully all the options, learn from others, learn from what other people have done. If you look at the oral history data sets that are in the DRI, many of them have also archived their consent forms and their information sheets. So you can look at them and compare it to them and try and work out why they made the decisions they made, and is it appropriate for you to do the same, or maybe it's appropriate for you to do something different. It's an enormous privilege to be able to listen to somebody else's story. I can honestly say it's been one of the privileges of my own research career that I've had the opportunity to do that and talk to people from all over the place, from very different backgrounds, and listen to their stories and archive some of them for future society. I think it's great that this event is happening, because it would be wonderful if there was more of this going on and more sharing of those privilege, those data sets, research data. And my final feeling is that if you do all this work at the beginning about in preparing your information sheet, ultimately you'll feel much more confident about the research that you do afterwards, and your research you do afterwards will be of a higher quality. Thank you. Oh, my slides are available, and I've added some more information resources, but I won't talk through them now. I can send them on afterwards.
Thanks so much, Aileen. Thanks for making it slightly less terrifying. there's definitely a balance to be struck, and there's lots I didn't know there. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce Liz Kylie. So Liz is a senior lecturer in social policy in the School of Applied Social Studies and co-chair of the Board of Women's Studies in UCC, University College Cork. She's on the steering group of the Oral History Network Ireland, and she is the researcher representative on the TUSLA Child and Family Agency Research Ethics Committee. She was a researcher on the HEA-funded Oral History Project on women's work in Ireland, 1936 to 1990, which generated an archive of oral histories now deposited and available on the Digital Repository of Ireland. She's currently involved in research network focused on reconstituting the Irish family in Ireland. She has published in the field of oral history research, and Liz will speak about planning an oral history project and undertaking an oral history project when the intention is to preserve the material for future use. She will identify the opportunities and challenges associated with preserving and archiving oral history and related material, and she will highlight the usefulness of good data management when planning from the outset. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, David. I hope you can see that. I'm sure you'll tell me if you can't. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real privilege to be asked to talk to you today and share my experience of doing an oral history project, and also to be on such a very good panel. So I just wanted to start, first of all, by speaking a little bit about oral history and getting a sense of what it is or what it involves. This is from Paul Thompson, who says, oral history thrusts life into history itself, widens its scope. It allows heroes, not just from leaders, but from the unknown majority of people. It brings history into and out of the community. In short, it makes for fuller human beings. So in that context, I think we capture the essence of what is oral history in many respects. I think also what Paul Thompson says in terms of the voice of the past matters to the present, but whose voice or voices are to be heard. And I think that's crucial again in the context of oral history, that we do know, for instance, that some people's history counts and other people's maybe history doesn't count. And that's what attracted me to oral history and to the idea of using it for our particular project, that it was a method that was very much used, or an approach in research that was used with very often the dispossessed or those below us rather than above us in many respects. And it ensures that, I suppose, voices that would otherwise be lost are included in the historical record. That's not to say oral history can't be used with others, but I suppose where it's come from, its origins, has very much been a history from below. So then the essence of oral history is very often the voice, what the person has to say, the orality as such, but also the audio, the listening to that voice. And I think that really sits at the heart of oral history work. And it's a preservation of that recorded interview that we do with a participant in our project, for example. And it is used for future reference and for use, as is captured by Schneider. So in that context, I think Aileen mentioned a lot about the idea of naming individuals or identifying individuals who participate in the oral history projects. And of course, that has been very typical of oral history, to recognize the people that have participated, who have given their accounts and who wish to be named or identified and who are proud of their histories as such. But of course, there are also challenges or problems with that naming. And again, we employ different kinds of strategies, I suppose, to address those issues in the context of our project. And I'll speak a little bit about that later in the context of my own. Also, I suppose very often with oral history, we don't want it to be an inquisition or adversarial or anything like that. We want to ask open questions. We want to hear what people have to say. We want to give them flexibility to respond in the way that they wish to respond. And that, again, I suppose, is very central to oral history work. So it is a longer interview very often. It sometimes can be a repeat interview where we return to hear more of what somebody has to say. And I think really at the heart of oral history is the orality, the voice, and the listening to that account. And that's very much central to this approach when it isn't so central to other approaches where we move very fast from gathering data to producing transcripts or to working with written material. This is taken from the Oral History Network of Ireland, of which I am a member of the steering group. And I think it really captures the life of an oral history project from the very start, where we conceive of a research question or an idea, and we start to plan out that project, right around to the archiving and maybe the dissemination that goes with that project. So it captures all of the different dimensions that happen in the course of a life of an oral history project. And I suppose, just like Aileen was mentioning, that there's a lot to think about when one starts out doing an oral history project. And some of that pertains to our obligations as researchers, to doing things properly or as correctly as we can, and to ensuring as well that I suppose we show respect to all that's involved in the projects that we're doing. So in that sense, this captures the procedures, the kind of formal ethics that Aileen was talking about as well, and the documentation that we require very often in relation to our projects. So from the start, I think what is really useful to have is a comprehensive interview pack that includes all of the documentation and the templates that we need when we're going about doing our oral history work, and which also includes the reminders of everything we need to carry with us or have with us when we're engaged in the project. Really convenient when we're working as part of a team, but also really convenient just when we're working as an individual. So I include everything in that interview pack. That would include, for example, any letters, documentation, absolutely everything that we need to remind ourselves about, checklists, anything like that. We also, of course, need to apply for formal ethics review very often in our institutions or organizations, and to get approval for the research that we're doing prior to engaging with human participants at all. Then, of course, we want to recruit, and my idea very often is that we try to retain as much control as we can over recruitment to ensure that it's done well and that we can stand over the process that's employed. So in that context, very often in oral history work, we put out a call for participants. We identify the kinds of people that we want to come forward, or that we want to participate in our research. We sometimes do that through media, but we also do it through organizations or, through social media or other mechanisms that we can use to get the word out that we'd like people to participate in our research. Letters of invitation to potential participants, where we start the process of engaging with them. Then, of course, very often we have to follow through with reminder letters. And sometimes if we have set up interview dates, for example, that we're checking to see that those interview dates still suit, either by email or with phone calls or whatever. We generally have the information sheet that Aileen spoke about and the consent form that we use with our potential participants. And of course, we very often record consent at the beginning of an interview as well. If we're engaged in interviews that involve some kind of collection of objects that we've asked people to, maybe talk about or to utilize in the context of the interview, maybe they're used as props or as data in their own right, or we've asked people to bring along photographs or any kind of memorabilia that help them to talk about aspects of their lives, well, then we need a requisition form where we take account of the kind of memorabilia or the objects that were utilized in the course of the interview. Maybe we're taking photographs of those, or we want to retain them as part of the data set. And in that context, we need information about them. And we also need to ensure that we know when they're meant to be returned and how they should be returned to the individual. And we want to ensure that we look after them while we have them. After the course of the interview, very often we return the transcript, or we may return the recording to the interviewee, or we may give them a copy of both. Generally, I suppose, you know, we can give interviewees a choice in relation to what they prefer. And then, of course, we also have a return visit pertaining to discussion of that transcript, but maybe prior to that, we do a sensitivity review and maybe look at that transcript and identify anything that we think may be problematic for the participant in the context of our duty of care to them, and at least check with them, is this okay? Are you happy for this to be included? So we might have additional issues that we point out to them in addition to the kinds of issues that they point out that they maybe are worried about themselves. We also meet participants again and then ask them to complete a recording agreement. This is after the interview, where I suppose very often we're thinking about, here we have a body of material and we want to engage with the participant in relation to how they're happy to have that material utilized into the future. Do they want to put certain conditions on how it is used or who uses it, or in relation to how we're going to use it in the context of publication or dissemination. Obviously, part of this process involves looking at issues that maybe need to be changed, aspects that need to be redacted, or, you know, edits that need to be made in the context of the interviewee, recognizing that their interview is going to be in an archive or held somewhere. And in that context, we are editing out whatever needs to be edited out, and we're ensuring that we have kept a close record of what the interviewee requires in terms of changes that need to be made. And finally, I suppose we're preparing that material for archiving, and that's a process in its own right. But equally, I suppose we also want to ensure that we continue to engage with the interviewees throughout the whole process of dissemination, so that they know what's happening, the material that they've given us or the accounts that they've given us, and also what's happening in relation to the archiving or the dissemination as much as possible. So in the context of oral history, there are a lot of ethical issues to consider, and I suppose in that sense, Aileen has covered many of these. There are the kind of formal ethical concerns that are there, that are involved, I suppose, in the process of ethical review and in getting approval for our projects. Very often we have to have a clear idea of what we're doing. We have to have all our documentation ready, and we have to have our oral history interview or our research instrument ready for review, because all that information is required for that purpose. Aileen has spoken about informed consent, but then of course there's also the process of the interview, and we want to ensure as much as possible that that's a positive process for anybody who comes forward and who is willing to tell us their story or give us their account. So in that context, we wish to be responsive to people's rights and their needs, to take them into account as much as possible, to ensure that we make the process as comfortable for them as possible. Open questions really help for people to feel at ease. We're trying to build very often a rapport at the beginning of the interview. So, you know, ways of doing that are very important to consider in relation to ensuring that we have a good start for the interview. And finally, of course, ending the interview can also require an attention to how the person is feeling, how the experience has been for them, if they have been upset or distressed through the course of the interview, spending time with them, debriefing them and assisting them to that, and identifying supports that they may need subsequent to the interview. So I suppose largely this requires a kind of an ethics of the everyday to ensure that somebody feels as comfortable as possible, and that it's a positive experience in as much as it can be for them when they're going through the interview process. Oral history very often has return visits, as I mentioned, particularly as well in the context of archiving, where, you know, all of that has to be set out and one has to see if somebody has more concerns than they maybe had at the very beginning of the process. Ensuring follow-up, and we, you know, very often like to stay in contact with the people that we've interviewed afterwards, particularly right throughout the period of dissemination, alerting them to when, you know, when we're interpreting, what kind of outputs we're producing, sharing those outputs with them. The recording agreement I've mentioned as being very important in the context of archiving in particular. And of course, there's huge ethical issues involved anyway when we begin to interpret or analyze data, when we're presenting data, you know, in terms of how we, you know, treat our research participants. And also, I suppose, in the context of archiving, there's huge concerns in relation to the people who participate in our projects, but also if we work as part of a team, there's also huge concerns in relation to our kind of duty of care to each other as well, in the context of exposing ourselves, I suppose, to further scrutiny when we make interviews available in the context of an archive. So there are ethical issues, I suppose, all of the way along, and some of them can be dealt with through the procedures of our universities, but others, I think, require an ethics of the everyday, or a post-humanist ethical kind of sensibility that we utilize throughout the course of the project. And that's more about, you know, day-to-day ethics, dealing with issues as they arise and thinking through the implications of those. This again is taken from the Oral History Network of Ireland. It's their recording agreement, and you can see there it's a sample, it's a template, but one can modify it or utilize it accordingly. Equally, the British Oral History Association, I know the American one, all of them provide templates and very useful resources that people can use for the purpose of their work. Clearly, it sets out all of the different ways in which the material can be used, and, you know, it provides, I suppose, a document that can be discussed and explained and elaborated on prior to somebody completing it. So in that context, it's, you know, all of these kinds of resources are very helpful, and we relied on them heavily in the context of doing our own project as well. We used whatever resources we could access in the context of making us think about what documentation we needed for our project. What do we need to conduct an oral history interview? Well, the required pack that I mentioned earlier, that has all of our documentation, our checklists, our reminders, good quality audio or video recording device. It doesn't have to be expensive, but it has to be reliable, and it has to be one that we're comfortable using. As a person who's not too technical, I just try to stick with the one kind of device. I'm very comfortable with it, and it gives me confidence that the recording will happen and that it will be good quality. We might need a professional photographer. We might need a camera to ensure we collect, you know, good quality visuals or photos. We need a quiet, comfortable environment. A sitting room in a house is an ideal location because it's not likely that there will be the noise from a fridge or a washing machine or a dishwasher or whatever. And there's a lot of soft furnishing and glasses of water in the context of ensuring that somebody has refreshment. And of course, we can also expect that we take breaks over the course of doing an oral history interview that sometimes can be quite long. I am certainly not an expert on data management, and I very much approach it as a researcher, and I know there's people here who are much more experienced and knowledgeable about data management, but I do think in the context of our project that if we had done a data management plan from the outset, it would have been really helpful. We did our project too early, and data management planning wasn't part of the culture of research at that time. So I suppose the data management plan from the outset focuses us to think about what kind of data will I be collecting? Is it going to be audio material only? Are we going to be transcribing? Are we going to be gathering photographs? Are we going to be gathering objects? What are all the different kinds of data I'm gathering over the course of a particular project? How do I need to keep a record of that data? What kind of metadata do I need? Metadata only refers to really the description of the data that we gather. So how can we keep good records of that data so that somebody who chooses to use that data later can understand the data, knows the context in which it was produced, knows how it was produced, and has access to as much documentation as possible that can make it understandable to somebody who's approaching it, not as a primary user or a gatherer of that data, but as a secondary user of that data as such. Then I suppose there's the issue of how we keep our data safe and how we manage it in the shorter term. And generally what I advise students and what I do myself is keep it in a locked filing cabinet if it's physical data, in a locked office, in a secure location. Clearly in the context of data that we're keeping on our computer or online, it has to be on an encrypted, password protected computer or laptop. Generally, we have to ensure that we do careful sharing of that data and careful transcription, and that we use reputable and reliable transcribers. Our institutions now, thankfully, have safe online storage facilities that can be of huge benefit for us. And we might need to keep certain kinds of documentation separate from other kinds, like, for example, the consent form separate from the data. But generally, we need to think about how can we keep the data safe in the short term, and then how can we keep it safe in the long term. Again, the online data storage facility is very useful, one that's trusted and that's being utilized by our institutions and where we have good IT support in relation to that. And also, I suppose it's very important generally for data retention purposes that we've one full data set that's maintained for the purposes of audit, etc. And most of our institutions have a required time frame by which we're obliged to keep data anyway that we have to observe. Generally, I suppose if we have oral history interviews, we have to prepare that data for archiving, and there's a process involved in that. The Digital Repository of Ireland, where our data is held, provides very good guides and very good training for people to access in relation to, you know, making sure that they can prepare their data for archival purposes. But equally, other archives provide such guidance and training as well. And clearly people as well who have experience of digital arts and humanities are very well prepared to be able to prepare data for archiving. And finally, I suppose when we do archive our data, we want people to know about it and to use it. And that requires some degree of publicity, sometimes by the archival institution, but we can also, I suppose, play a part in that. So we can share it with the people who have contributed to it, whose stories are there, their families, their communities, and of course many other stakeholders, researchers, etc., who want to use that data to ask different questions or maybe to supplement their own data sets with the data that we've also created. So I'm now going to shift gear a little and look a little bit at the project that we did. It was a project on women's work that was undertaken, you know, and looking at the period of the 1940s right up to the 1960s in Ireland. It was an oral history project. It was part of a much larger project that was funded by the Higher Education Authority, and it was conducted in our university. So this project focused on women's working lives in 3 Munster counties, Cork, Limerick and Kerry. We took a feminist theoretical approach to this project, and very much the methodology was feminist in design. So we saw ourselves as doing feminist oral history. Most of the data collection, all of the data collection took place in the years, the early years of the 2000s, 2002, 2003. I'm crediting there Dr. Maureen, who worked on this project with me, and the other members, also the research officers, and we also had some student interviewers as well who used this opportunity really to get interview experience or experience of doing oral history work too. So this was a thematic qualitative oral history interview. These interviews generally took place over 1 to 2 hours. They were with women, talking to them about all aspects of their working lives, extending from childhood to old age. So we very often started out with a very general question about, tell me about your early life. And we ended up talking to them about their lives as they were older women. So there was a lot of intergenerational discussion about these women's lives vis-a-vis their mothers' lives and their daughters' lives, but also in the context of their working lives, but I suppose relative to their status. Women who stayed single, women who married, women who became widowed, or women who took up religious vocations. There's also, I would argue, in this data set, a very strong focus on social class, on generational dimensions, on the gender aspect as well. So we were thinking of this period being, you know, very often seen in Irish society as a more repressed period in the context of women's lives, where there was a marriage bar, where women didn't really have extensive public lives or weren't permitted, or it wasn't acceptable for them to have extensive public lives. So in that context, we wanted to know how women experienced these aspects, how they experienced the marriage bar, having to give up work upon marriage, you know, having to move into, you know, a marital situation and, you know, kind of very much live in the private sphere as such, and how do they carve out a public role if they did, you know, if they continued to work, how they managed that, how they, you know, their relations were in the context of their working lives as well. So we were interested in all of those different kind of dimensions and how they were negotiated by women as they moved through their lives. Generally, oral history produces very rich data, and this project kind of, I think, indicates that. So we produced a lot of different kinds of dimensions from this project. You will see that some of those involved, you know, really kind of recognizing that this was you know, data we could listen to. So there was a website created, there was a multimedia exhibition, and there was an online collection that is now available and in place in the Digital Repository of Ireland, and which people can access apart from the other products. This gives you a sense of the physical collection. It wasn't huge, but it's kept in UCC's archive and it's not available to the public. We would have liked to make it available, but it wasn't possible to do that in the context of the resources that we had. This gives you a sense of the archival collection that's available in the Digital Repository of Ireland. This is a picture of Madge at the time when she was interviewed, but also a picture of Madge in her earlier life. And we also conducted an interview with her. And so it involves the collection of a number of interviews, 42 recorded interviews with women about their working lives. As I mentioned, we do hope it can be utilised by others who are interested in it, because it covers a wide range of different kinds of topics or areas that were explored in the context of these oral histories. There's already been a lot of discussion about ethics and the ethical use of archival material. I suppose is something that concerns us when we place material in an archive. We want to ensure as much as possible that it can be understood by those who use it, that it's looked after, and I suppose that was really why we put it in the Digital Repository of Ireland. We knew it was a trusted archive, the material could be looked after, but also it provided possibility for others to access this material and to ensure as much as possible that it was held safely for those who gave up their stories or their accounts. It's not to say that there aren't many challenges, there are. Good planning from the outset helps, but it's not always possible to plan for every eventuality. Costing and funding is crucial, and I think even though our budget for this project was significant, we had many other costs that we didn't anticipate. Media obsolescence is a big problem. We had a website, that website went out of date, we couldn't access the developer. So we were delighted when we found a DRI solution in terms of making our material available. We got commitments that didn't materialize in many respects from our institution, largely because things had moved on and it became too difficult to honor those commitments. We didn't have always the knowledge and skills that we needed for this purpose. And finally, I suppose things can happen like pandemics that make the whole research process difficult anyway. So
thanks, Liz.
This is just a list of resources that people can use, and Doug's book with Mary Larson is there, and I would strongly recommend it on the basis that I've used it quite substantively. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was a great overview of the process, and I really wasn't aware of the Oral History Network and the potential there for helping people. And you have a really good structure there, and also I liked your clear emphasis on a duty of care and ethics in the process, which chimes with Aileen's talk as well. So it's fantastic, and I just realised what a potential minefield an oral history is. But a worthwhile exercise. So thanks again so much. Now we're running a little bit over time, but we're not too bad. Doug, how are you doing? I'm introducing now Doug Boyd, PhD, who serves as the director for the Louise B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries. Doug's the recent president of the Oral History Association, presumably the American one. Doug envisioned, designed, and implemented the open source and free OHMS system, which synchronizes text with audio and video online. And in 2019, he received a Fulbright Scholars Research Grant to collaborate with the National Library of Australia on innovative access to online oral history. Doug's talk will introduce OHMS and its capabilities and discuss both practical strategies for integrating OHMS into archival workflows and the utilization of OHMS by oral history projects outside of the archive.
Thanks for having me. I will say that the Oral History Network of Ireland is an incredible resource. It's actually one that I, whenever they hold, one of the positives about COVID-19 was that I'm able to attend workshops and webinars and things all over the world. And Oral History Network of Ireland is always one of my favorites that I find to be the most useful. So, so I'm going to talk about the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer and this tool that I created, OHMS. Before I talk about that, I want to talk about, or just give you a frame of reference for the Louise B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky. So I am the director of the Nunn Center. The Nunn Center has been recording interviews since 1973. We have 5 full-time faculty members and staff, 2 people who serve as interviewers.
Sorry, Doug, do you want to pop that into slideshow view?
I don't. Thank you for asking.
Okay,
but,
okay. Sorry.
But I jump around a great deal.
Yeah, no, absolutely fine. Thanks.
So we've got 5 full-time faculty and staff, only 2 interviewers, but 3 people who serve on the archive side. The majority of interviews that we conduct or bring into the archive are conducted by external partnerships, say the organization that we've partnered with, another university where their archive doesn't archive oral histories. We have over 10 or 12 people now on campus, faculty, professors who are conducting interviews actively and archiving those with us. Multiple students around campus, but still, I think the majority of interviews are coming in via these external partnerships. We have now over 16,000 interviews in our collection, and at the moment, 50 plus active interviewing projects that are going on right now as we speak. Of course, many of those were sort of waiting until COVID-19 waned a little bit and now have reactivated. We did conduct lots of interviews remotely. That's a whole different webinar that we can talk about, conducting remote interviews. But we also have a podcast that we're reactivating. It's a lovely little podcast that I love producing called the Wisdom Project podcast. But one of the things that we do very actively, one of the reasons I was invited to speak here was the work that we're doing enhancing access to the interviews that we have, not all of them, but our work really with online interviews. And I think this comes out of something that greatly frustrated me as a young archivist. And I think, one of the reasons we all, which I am no longer a young archivist, but we all go into this business, this oral history business. You've heard great presentations about the importance of oral history. We all go into oral history to put individual stories on the historical record. We want to somehow connect the individual story to this large historical record. And so this notion of the philosophical question, the great philosophical question, if a tree falls in the archive and there's no one there to hear it, does it actually make a sound? I got my little animation here that I worked really hard on back in 2008. So I keep it in my presentations. So this notion of oral history in the archive, it's one thing to conduct it. It's one thing for you, the researcher, to use your own material and write your books and, get your tenure and write your articles and give your presentations around the world. That's different. I think once you put an interview in the archive and it becomes accessible to other people to use it as research. We've heard a lot of mention of oral history as data throughout the first two presentations, data. And the problem with oral history back in 2008, when I came to the Nunn Center after working as an archivist for just oral history for about 8 years prior to that, was this notion of discoverability, usability, the idea of accessing oral history online was still very much an analog experience. And by analog, I don't mean this. We were very much digitizing interviews at this point. I'm always assuming now I'm the oldest person in the room. And so some of you out there, I know are students who did not grow up listening to music this way. But I cannot explain to you enough how challenging it was when your favorite song was on side 2 of this audio cassette, what the work that you had to do in order to locate your favorite song when it was on side 2 was so challenging in this analog environment. Well, when putting interviews online, they may be digital, but it's still a time-based medium. And so it's linear. And so you may have an audio recording, but you're still trying to find your way. You may have a transcript, and your transcript may actually indeed be searchable, right? Great. But now if you want to go to the moment from the transcript to the audio recording or the video recording, best of luck to you, because it takes a lot of work, even though it is digital and digitized. So even though we had oral histories in digital archives at the time, the research experience the experience for the researcher was still very much an analog, physical, time-based, long-term commitment. And as a result, very few interviews in the archive actually got used. I would argue, relatively speaking, very few interviews that have been conducted since the beginning of oral history are still being used in very little numbers. So one of the things that I set out to do in 2008 was this OHMS thing. I was looking for a technical solution for this problem that we all have these amazing oral history interviews in our archives, yet very few interviews were actually being used, which means, by the way, those interviews that were being conducted weren't actually fulfilling the original mission of why the person who conducted those interviews did so, putting them on the historical record. If nobody listens, I question the point of this thing that we're doing. Now, I'm not saying put everything online, and we're going to get to that, but I do question the practice if there's nobody's going to listen to these. So in 2008, I launched OHMS, the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, and it was really a way. I'm going to switch now to the web. So wish me luck. Here I go. In 2008, when I created OHMS, OHMS had two. Let me go back to that and one more time. Choose optimize for video clip. There we go. So when I created OHMS in 2008, 2009, it did one thing. It allowed you, this is an interview we have in our archive with Martin Luther King, conducted in 1964 by the author Robert Penn Warren. If we search on the word revolution, for example, oops, I misspelled it, so we get nothing. If we spell it correctly, search on the word revolution, each time Martin Luther King and the interviewer talk about the civil rights movement as a revolution, it takes you there. And with a click, you see the search hit with a click.
Your leaders in this struggle were at war with each other.
Takes you
then
to
I
the moment.
think it would be very difficult to make this social revolution the kind of powerful revolution that it's proved to be.
So discovery just took seconds. I think in order to find a very specific piece of information in an oral history interview. Oral history is a complex package that's cumbersome to use in the archive. Obviously, untextualized oral history is even more cumbersome and challenging. And so how can we pair up the text with the player was my goal when I created OHMS originally. So very quickly, I realized at the scale that the Nunn Center works, we were not going to be able to afford to transcribe every single interview that comes into the archive, especially since we work with so many external partners. And so very quickly, I realized after I had created the super cool search system that we ran out of transcripts. There was nothing else to put online. And so I sought a different solution because transcripts themselves are also limited. People can, we all know that transcripts have their issues as well. None of them are actually perfect. And so if you're reading a transcript, I urge you to listen to the audio or the original video, to listen to the tone of the person's voice, listen to the nuances. Things like sarcasm, they don't translate into a transcript very well. So it's important. Also, the mere placement of a comma in a sentence changes the meaning of that sentence completely. So time to eat, grandma, with a comma is very different from time to eat, grandma, without a comma. So I was looking for some way to enhance access to oral history interviews in the archive when they didn't have a transcript, or even if they did. So in 2012, I created the indexing system of the OHMS system. And the indexing system works similarly to what you saw before. Search on a word, say in this case, Philadelphia. So each time Philadelphia is discussed as a topic, it takes you there. And you see these titles here. These titles represent changes, major changes in the narrative that was recorded. But if you click on one of them, you see it opens up a whole world of additional metadata. So a partial transcript, a synopsis of the segment, keywords about what's being discussed, subjects, if you're a library or an archive and you use something like Library of Congress subject headings here in the United States, or the European equivalent, you can have that field if you want. And so the idea was with a click.
Now, I'm very interested in finding out more about domestic service.
You're able to be taken to the moment that story begins. So again, it's a different search. Somebody can talk about living under segregation for 3 hours in a transcript and never once mention the word segregation. However, in an indexing context where you're cataloging, you're conducting metadata at a different level now, you're able to achieve something different. Within 20 seconds of looking at this index list of titles, you actually are able to kind of get a sense of what this interview is about and what topics you want to dig into and research more completely and commit to. Now, as I mentioned, I created the indexing module really as a way to balance out when we don't have transcripts in the archive for that particular interview. However, when we do have a transcript, they work together in a really beautiful way. So you can take that same search hit and search, and it takes you to those moments in the transcript as you saw before. But you can also see that there are these little dots here with the circle, and that tells you in the transcript, hey, a story begins in this moment. This is the title of the story. And if you want more information, you can click on that and you're taken over to the index. What I didn't mention about the index was the ability to add GPS coordinates. And so when somebody is talking about something that involves place, which is a lot of oral history, then OHMS interacts with the Google Maps. And so you can actually spatialize the subjects that are being discussed. And likewise, you can put up photographs, images. So while she's talking about aspects of something that has a photographic element, you can link to it while you're listening to that person speak. Additionally, I will just say before I go out of OHMS that we did implement in about 2015 the ability to do bilingual OHMS. And so you can upload a transcript and a translation. And in this case, you can index in 2 languages. In this case, this is a master blender at a Canadian distillery. We do a lot of work with the bourbon industry. This is not bourbon, this is Canadian whiskey, just to be clear. But we did a bilingual rendering of that. And so you can upload a transcript and a translation as well, both of which are searchable, all of which synchronizes to that audio. What you're looking at here is the OHMS viewer. The viewer hooks up to your system. I wasn't going to expect that if I were to create my own content management or collection management system, that every library in the world would indeed switch, because that's a very difficult ask to say, hey, switch because of this oral history thing. Most archives aren't just about oral history. Most archives do a lot of other things and have oral history. So the idea was to create something that was a little bit more flexible. And so this viewer here installs in any system. It's called by a simple hyperlink. And so we've embedded the viewer into our system here. So, but the viewer is what you see on the front end. The back end of OHMS is really this thing that you get a free account. You could sign up for an account right now. And once I log off, I have to approve accounts, but once I log off, I will. But the idea is this web-based tool that you can actually upload your interview into and begin to synchronize your transcript or index the interview or manage that metadata. And so the indexing module looks a little like this. You have your interview, you hit play, you press tag, and you click on this. And this is an example of one that's already done. And you can start typing and typing these things out. One of the bourbon interviews is a really good example of indexing, where you can upload a thesaurus of terms. So if you have a controlled vocabulary that you use for your interviews, you can upload that and begin to type. And as you type, if you have a series of terms that you particularly want to use for your bourbon project, then it will suggest those terms to you as you index, which is really fantastic. And so it's very powerful, but this is a web-based system. So the back end is separate from the front end. When you finish, you export your work and you take it over to where you've installed your interview on the front end, or you've installed your viewer on the front end, and voila, it shows up. So this whole system here that we're just looking at here is where all 16,000 plus interviews, almost 17,000, are located, where you can browse our projects and you can search across all. And because of the indexing and the searchable transcripts, the search is literally part of this. So Martin Luther King talks about grappling with this, like he grapples with this and that. So when you search on the word grapple, which is a word that would never appear in metadata, actually takes you to his interview because it appears in that transcript. So the I'm going to switch back to PowerPoint and wrap things up. So the idea was to enhance access to these interviews. And we did get a grant in 2012 to make it open source and free, because before 2012, it was really just us that was using the system. And 2014, we launched it to the public. And as of yesterday, it's in 63 different countries, being used by, I think, over 700 institutions now. So it's extremely successful and very popular system. I think more importantly, I mean, I'm proud of that. I'm very proud of that. So not to diminish that, but I'm very committed to this idea in oral history and the archive of sustainability. Obviously I've I've helped, I think, improve usability and discoverability, but also this idea of sustainability. So OHMS, as a result, is an incredibly simple system to actually commit to. And as a result, we are actually moving to a scenario where we have interviews being accessed all over the world. I think at last count, we have almost 17,000 interviews. 6,000 of those interviews are online. Our online interviews were utilized 231,000 times last year. So when we talk about oral history as data, this is actually really, really important. I've got some really beautiful examples of discovery of our collections, one of which is an example I give often. 2014, somebody requested this interview from us. The requester was in Italy, which is wonderful. You know, people are searching for our interviews all over the world now, and I love that. But this particular person wanted access to this particular interview with Marshall Webb, who was a World War II veteran who had fought in this little village, this town down on the coast between Rome and Naples, called Tremensuoli. And turns out this veteran broke out into a poem about the battle that he fought in Tremensuoli in the middle of this oral history recording. But like a good reference archivist, our people said, hey, researcher, you've requested this. He was writing his first novel about this town of Tremensuoli being set during the war. And he really, you know, like a good reference operation, we said, would you like us to look for anyone else who might have actually fought in the battle to give you more information? And he came back with a very quick no. Most people who are writing a book would absolutely say yes to that question. And so I'm going to build up suspense. This is actual battle footage from the Library of Congress of Tremensuoli and the fighting that was happening there. A few minutes later, the researcher sent us a photograph that he had taken, and the photograph was of this alley. And in this alleyway, sure enough, Marshall Webb, the person that we had interviewed for almost 4 hours back in 1992, I think, had carved his name on the wall in the alleyway. And so you can literally, we've told this story a gazillion times, and so many people have gone over to see this, that the city has put up a plaque now of Marshall Webb, his poem about Tremensuoli. You can actually stand in that alleyway and link to this moment, when the moment in this 3.5-hour interview, almost 4-hour interview, when Marshall Webb breaks out into his poem about fighting in this small town of Tremensuoli. And I think this is really a fantastic example of moving away from this sort of very linear analog model of access to this model, which is where we're actually serving an enormous audience. I'll finish by saying just very clearly that this, be careful what you wish for, because our interviews, yes, indeed, are being used over 231,000 times. But as you've heard throughout this webinar, a good oral history interview contains an incredible amount of detail. And that detail can sometimes be things that are potentially problematic. And so we have really had to adjust our workflow and our interaction with each interview to make sure that we're actually finding those moments that are in each interview potentially, and considering them thoughtfully and carefully. We've put together an entirely comprehensive sensitivity check process that allows us, instead of, we say a lot about informed consent, but I'm not sure we're ready to fully actually explain to everyone we interview the implications of putting their private information online and into an archive. It's not even online, it's into the archive. And so as we sort of move into this phase of informed accessioning, so the archive knows what we're bringing in, we know, yes, we can celebrate the successes of putting our interviews online, so that tree falling in the archive is something that actually connects and resonates with our users and our researchers. And I really think we're in the early stages of oral history online in terms of grappling with this idea of ethics and privacy. I think the answer is not to hide everything away and not let anybody listen to it. And so we need to, find that balance and move forward in a very careful, ethical, and thoughtful framework, a compassionate framework. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was really superbly interesting, and something I certainly relate to as a software person myself. Just one point from your thing that stood out was the idea of metadata and the data itself when searching. So you mentioned the word grapple never appears in the metadata, and vice versa. Segregation didn't appear in the transcript. And it's just an interesting point maybe for researchers to sort of understand that the importance of metadata in describing research artifacts like this. We are now at past, or yeah, just gone past, and this event was only scheduled to go until this time. So we don't really have a whole lot of time for questions today, but I will take one or two if people wish to ask them. And if Doug, Aileen, and Liz, if you want to turn on your cameras just for a couple of minutes, and Stephanie, then we can there's actually, let's see, we've got 3 open questions here. One from Ian O'Donnell. Have ethics committees / IRBs deemed any areas to be out of bounds for oral historians? Have they become more risk averse in recent years? And would anybody like to, I don't know what an IRB is. Irish Research Board, perhaps?
Oh, Institutional Review Board. It's
excuse me.
ethics
Thank you.
Process in the United States, which is different from. Actually, I can't really speak about the States, but in Ireland, ethics committees tend to be based in universities, and they're all different. There isn't a national standard, so they all have their own guidance. I sat in the one in Maynooth for the last. For a while, and I haven't seen any research that has been refused an application, but there's possibly more documentation that's asked of people. And I have seen cases where people, when they sent documentation, there's been a conversation about, have you considered this, or should this, which actually I think is the way an ethics review board should work. It should be there to advise and to help people conduct their research ethically. Now I'm speaking about non-students. I think within universities there are often limits on what ethics students or what research students are allowed to do as part of their research process. I have heard of that, but
okay, thank you very much. One from anonymous attendee. Have the speakers considered the Harassment, Harmful Communications and Related Offensive Acts, also known as COCO's Law, and how this might impact on oral archives and publications? I don't know anything about COCO's Law myself. Now, that's no surprise.
Well, looking at it, it has 2 parts. One is about sending intimate images without consent.
Right.
And I can't say that would impact on archives. And then the second part is covers publishing or distributing what they describe as grossly offensive communication about another person with the aim of conducting harm. And I suppose plausibly that might have an impact. I actually think the defamation law in Ireland is a much greater concern. But not a lawyer, so and I don't know if there's been any cases taken under COCO's law yet. So I know my lawyer friends always say to me, this will be decided in the courts. So until there's court cases, it's hard to know what the impact's going to be.
Another one from Ian here. Have there been any occasions in which interview content has been censored? If so, can this be done in such a way that future generations may be able to uncensor, perhaps in light of changing sensibilities? So if you're redacting...
We get this request a lot, and the Nunn Center has actually made a policy now that if something is going to be redacted, it's a permanent destructive edit that never comes back. Otherwise, I would rather restrict the entire interview for the duration of the period, because I think from an ethical standpoint, from the researcher's perspective, if we're providing one version of an interview to someone and then 20 years later provide an entirely different version of that interview, somebody could have based an entire doctoral dissertation based on one thing only to learn something completely different, that they were wrong and it was the exact same resource. So I'm not going to say we do not edit anything when requested to do so by the interviewee, but we really do restrict that to very extreme scenarios. And I will try to have that interview restricted for the long term prior, rather than redacting. And I think it's really dangerous for an archive to curate things at a sentence level when you're talking about, assuming that when the employees who are no longer working there, passing down something like that through the generations is very, very challenging and difficult to actualize.
Yeah, thank you. Question from Deirdre Lane here. How can QR codes be linked geographically to your database for all to access, Doug? I think you had an example of that with the Italian battle.
Yeah, you can actually link to not just an interview, but you can link to the actual stories themselves. And so it's a very effective way of getting people into not just the 4-hour interview, which could take time if you're standing in that alleyway with your smartphone that doesn't have a great international data plan. So if you want to be more precise, you are able to actually utilize the link directly to the specific moment, which is really helpful.
Okay, we're just about at the end there. I do have one question. Probably you're in the best position to answer it, Doug, because it's technical. How do you see the role of artificial intelligence and data mining playing with transcripts? So if you have lots of transcripts online, say around civil rights or whatever, could you, are you aware of any developments there or any problems that might solve for the research community?
Oh, it's going to be very powerful. It's already very powerful. It's made speech recognition incredibly better than it was before. But the idea to harvest, the ability to harvest and analyze data has really been pretty transformative. And so in terms of data analysis, you won't be able to just aggregate interviews in my collection, but you'll be able to aggregate interviews from all over the world, I think, when we're providing this level of access. And that's incredibly exciting. Archives are already, including mine, starting to utilize this technology through text mining and such to more efficiently process the interviews that are in our archive. We're doing speech recognition on every interview that comes in now to our archive, and are going to be putting measures into place to try and extract keywords automatically for ones we haven't indexed yet. Not that we're going to make that information public. That is just for back-end internal use for us. But when you talk about the security implications of cloud-based computing and personal information, there's always going to be potential problems. I think the privacy implications of, a lot of people who say, oh, in the 1970s, they didn't sign up to put their interviews on the online because they didn't know the internet existed. Well, the argument of like, well, they didn't know the internet existed, but then like they didn't know, artificial intelligence was going to exist. And that accelerates that conversation. And so I think the thing that really concerns me isn't so much the aggregating of the data, but is more the deep fake technology that I think is out there, that the artificial intelligence has created the ability that today, you have the ability to utilize technology that can analyze an interview and replicate a voice, including speech patterns and cadences. I don't know if you're on social media, but here in the States, you see a fake Tom Cruise. It's become a meme where fake Tom Cruise does all kinds of things that Tom Cruise wouldn't normally do. This is deep fake technology that is not reserved for just, the incredibly wealthy. You can sign up for accounts and utilize this technology. And the ability to fabricate oral history we have it already. So what are the implications of that? And as we think about archives and their role, I think we're also seeing a shift, and I think we're going to see archives playing a role that's more dealing with authenticity and such moving in the future. So I think we've got a lot of work to do, I think, on the oral history side of things and on the archive side of things for sort of grappling with, I think, some of the things to come, including that artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you to Aileen and Liz as well, and also to my colleagues Stephanie and Anya for working so hard to organise this event. I would like to say that we will be circulating a feedback form after this to everyone, and I can certainly share it with the speakers today. And in that form, there will be an option for, if you have any comments, like there was a request there for training specifically on remote recording of oral histories, which came up in Doug's talk. I think there's a lot of training opportunities that could come out of this. Some of this could fall under LIR, but other opportunities would be, maybe facilitated by the Oral History Network. We've been literally overwhelmed by the number of people in attendance today. I think we were up to a good 80 or 90 for the entire session, which is really a very strong turnout. So I just wanted to say thank you, and Anya, if you could just switch on your camera and just give everyone a wave as well, because thanks again, thanks a million, everyone. Let's take this further in some other way next time. I'm so grateful for your time and expertise, speakers. Good night.